The globalists have launched a war against humanity and civilization. Their goal is complete destruction of nations and the creation of a global, unitary, technological government. In this pursuit, having no democratic authority, they use their obscene fortunes to dominate finance, politics, health, media, and every aspect of our lives. Many people and websites are giving excellent coverage of ongoing events and revelations. Many brave people are speaking out in great personal risk. All these are directed towards the Great Awakening, but awakening is not enough. The globalists don't fear it. No one elsewhere is setting out a roadmap for defeating the globalists before they eat us up. The globalists have a plan. Patriots need a plan. This is the purpose of Nations Over Globalism, to show how patriots can defeat practically the New World Order. We need a new constitution for each nation where the globalists and their corrupt helpers cannot operate. We need a peaceful revolution in every nation. Nothing short of this will do. Nations Over Globalism can be seen as a political party in the making, so it has an all-inclusive program and an all-inclusive analysis. We need to rebuild our nations from top to bottom to banish the globalists. The globalists are parasites, nothing more. Nations Over Globalism covers all bases: constitution, civilization, economics, political philosophy, sovereign nationhood, globalist parasites, politics, history, welfare services, political science. It has to be comprehensive. All will come together to form a unified political program and a theory of government and nations. The patriotic fight to overcome the globalist parasites must occur within each nation, for it is the nation that will defeat them. But nevertheless, it is a global battle because every nation is facing the same onslaught from the globalists and their hired traitors. The democratic machinery is damaged but not broken. We must contest elections to raise our profile as a political force in pursuit of our goal. The mainstream media can ignore street demonstrations. They cannot ignore parliamentary success. I will expand Nations Over Globalism's internet presence and hold online conferences and webinars. I want to hear your point of view. We need an international movement of separate sovereign nations acting independently. In addition to these recorded videos, I will be doing live broadcasts. So stay in touch by signing up for the Nations Over Globalism newspaper at the website www.nationsoverglobalism.uk. I am Peter Keller, writer, presenter, and creator of Nations Over Globalism, coming to you from Toulouse in southern France. If you are a patriot, I need your support.
Margaret Thatcher left office as Prime Minister on the 28th of November 1990, following 11 years on the job after a ruthless political assassination by her colleagues in the Tory Party. So, it might be thought that any comment on her should belong in the history section rather than the politics section. The latter normally covers the politics of the day or the recent past. The point is that everything that Thatcher did in office is still with us in some form or another. So, everything she did is current. Margaret Thatcher is not yesterday's news in any sense. New Labour under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown was even more Thatcherite than Thatcher herself and added big time to the calamities she engineered. The Tory Party, since its return to power, has remained, of course, 100% Thatcherite in its general outlook. The legacy she left is a ghastly one. She all but destroyed the nation that I grew up in and loved. It is also sweeping and vast in its compass, touching practically every aspect of politics and society. As a result, I make no apology for presenting the subject of her legacy in 3 parts. If we want to understand the Britain of today, we must understand how it was reformed by Thatcher in her long term of office. And she was not ditched by her party because the party wanted a change of direction, but because she had become insufferable. She had upset many of the major figures in her party and her government. Michael Heseltine and Nigel Lawson resigned, but the last straw was the resignation of Geoffrey Howe, who then proceeded to put the boot in with a long, damning address to the House of Commons. The party also judged that she had become insufferable to the nation and that she would lose the next general election. The irony is that in spite of her ignominious fall, she became heralded as an inspirational, transformative figure who had taken the country by the scruff of the neck and kicked it back into shape, fit for the future. She was given the kind of funeral normally reserved for royalty or great national heroes. And so, the myth surrounding her was cultivated. No other British Prime Minister has ever had their name converted into a concept, and the concept of Thatcherism is a viable and useful one. It does stand for a distinctive kind of politics and, of course, economics, at least in style. Most of it can be fairly well equated with new liberalism, which if she did not invent it, she could be said to have put it on the political and economic map, and not just in Britain, where it remains and retains its primacy. The dominance of neoliberalism is essentially the same thing as the dominance of globalism. In its development since the 1980s, it has facilitated the growth and power more and more of the parasitic class that is always beholden to globalism. So it was Thatcher that launched us onto the horrors of the globalism that we are now subject to. That is why we need to understand the transformations she made. And she provides an excellent object of study of where we are because her changes penetrated every aspect of society in a comprehensive and detailed way. Before moving to part 1 of this series, I will firstly give the contents of the 3 sections, comprising 15 in all, in order to give an overview of the scope of her influence. Part 1. 1. Thatcherite economics, libertarianism. 2. Thatcherite economics, monetarism. 3. Exploitation of prime ministerial power. 4. Privatisation. 5. The Falklands War. Part 2. 6. The Channel Tunnel. 7. Industrial relations. 8. The attack on the civil society. A. Attack on the civil service. B. Attack on the professions. C. Attack on the universities. 9. Centralisation of the state. 10. The Union of Britain. Part 3. 11. Aggressive foreign policy. 12. Contracting out. 13. Council house sales. 14. The poll tax. 15. Destruction of the Conservative Party. Who was Margaret Thatcher? When we saw the massive police presence for Margaret Thatcher's funeral on the 17th of April 2013, when we see the permanent, ongoing high security that is necessary for her tomb in Royal Chelsea Hospital, we will be seeing graphically what Thatcher was about: division and conflict. She is admired by some for her strength of will, For others, she was an unyielding, headstrong fanatic. Even her own party and close colleagues could not stomach her in the end and plotted her assassination as party leader and ignominiously dumped her. They knew they had to do the job before the British voters got hold of her. For many years now, mainstream politicians have never discussed what Thatcher actually did in power. She has become a subject of pure myth-making. All the tributes to her are made in vague terms, referring to conviction and determination. It is just about myth-building. As a populist, she would have understood and approved of this. I will discuss here and in subsequent videos not the myth of Thatcher, but her actions when in power. But in order to understand what Thatcher and her long reign as Prime Minister were about, you must begin by understanding three essential points about her that mark her out from other politicians, especially those of her day. Firstly, she was a populist. She never saw fellow politicians, the civil service, intermediate levels of government like the local authorities, or any outside professional groups as allies. In short, she detested them. She did not see herself as a leader working through government and democratic channels or cooperating with colleagues. Her method was to jump over all their heads and appeal directly to popular opinion. Like all populist politicians, she believed she had a direct line to the will of the people, and so democratic institutions were only a necessary nuisance to be exploited for grander purposes. Of course, it only ever worked with a minority, and even then only temporarily. Her populist approach explains why she ended her political life in isolation from her political colleagues, and eventually in political assassination. Secondly, Margaret Thatcher was the first Prime Minister to introduce ideology into the British political landscape. What exactly is ideology? An ideology is a set of ideas or beliefs that are adopted by a group of people, which then serve to separate that group from everyone else. The ideology functions not as a position from which discussion with others can take place, but as a weapon to defeat those who do not subscribe to it. This is because ideologies rest on a certain interpretation of the world, in this case meaning economics and society. Of course, Britain has seen ideologies before, on the left and on the right, but never near the pinnacles of power. With ideologies always goes political hygienism, and I mean by this that those subscribing to the ideology believe the world would be a better place if everyone thought like them. Of course, this is fundamentally undemocratic, but as I've said, Thatcher was a populist, not a democrat. She sought to bypass the machinery of state to gain support. She saw no virtue in a pluralist society and was dismissive of opponents. She wanted everyone to agree with her and adopt her agenda, and was prepared to use social engineering in pursuit of this aim. Before Thatcher, Britain could make some claim to believing in consensus politics, and this went across the political spectrum. She ended that for good. If you want to understand why the word divisive is applied to her so often, the explanation is in the fact that she was an unrestrained ideologue. Margaret Thatcher, in her influence, is far from dead. She herself may be gone, but Thatcherism lives on with full force. This is why I want, in this video and the two following ones, to catalogue the policies that directly sprang from her person during the 80s. I want to insist that a full assessment is necessary because almost all of her policies bear directly onto the state we are in now. And an assessment of Thatcher educates us into an appreciation of what we lost, what she stole from us. This inevitably means this is going to be a long story, so I've split it into 3 parts. For this, I make no apology. And this list concerns only the most important Thatcherite policies. It is not long, because I am discussing every minute aspect of her career. I will start with the biggest disaster she created and the one that impacts the most strongly on the economics and politics of today, and I will do so for many years ahead. I underline that this is the biggest, but that is not to say that all the rest are not also big. Thirdly, she only maintained power by virtue of two massive one-off bonanzas that fell into her lap. These enabled the government she ran, with all its misguided and treacherous policies, to maintain some normality and prevent the whole economy collapsing. These bonanzas were created, one, by North Sea oil, which began to create serious tax revenues at the start of her reign, and two, the selling off of publicly owned industries, mostly at knockdown prices. Any reasonable leader would have used these as national treasures that should be used to create long-term benefits for the country, but not Thatcher. She shamelessly used the windfalls for shoring up tax receipts as she destroyed large parts of the economy, for paying out massive amounts on unemployment benefits, and for politicking to help her win another term. We have never recovered from the loss of these precious resources that belonged to the nation. Part 1. Thatcherite Economic Libertarianism. The ideology that Thatcher signed up to was libertarianism of the type put forward by the Austrian School of Economics. The greatest figure in this school was Ludwig Mises, who formulated its main principles, while his pupil Hayek became a propagandist for Austrian thinking in the West, first in Britain and then in the USA. Hayek was a lightweight compared with Mises, but he was more successful as a popularizer than Mises and wrote a bestseller, The Road to Serfdom, in which he outlined his theory that state intervention would lead automatically to dictatorship. Also, he unexpectedly received the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976, although he had to share it, and this brought him into the public eye. It was through Hayek's teaching that Thatcher came to know about Austrian economics. Libertarianism is not a word that Thatcher or her supporters ever used or use, but her adherence to the Austrian version of it is what marks her out as a true ideologist. This is a word usually associated with extreme elements of the US Republican Party or with US independents like Ron Paul. So what is libertarianism? In order to understand libertarianism, you have to see it in relation to classic liberalism. Liberalism is the idea that people should have freedom to do what they want, as far as is possible. Everyone accepts that freedom can never be total, but that we must have laws that inevitably constrain some freedom of choice. The point about this conception of liberalism is that it does not prescribe government policy. Yes, we should have freedoms, but the conventional liberal view sees these as quite independent of policy on other matters, such as how we should run the economy, for instance. To use the jargon, liberalism is not instrumental. Libertarianism is different, for it holds that extensions of freedom should constitute an instrument of policy. By freeing everything up so that there are minimum constraints, great policy objectives, such as, say, a prosperous economy, can be achieved. Extreme libertarians are sometimes called anarcho-libertarians, for they propose such a minimal role for government that something close to anarchy would reign. You can see in many fields how the libertarian view dominated Thatcher's policy and thinking. Notably, she created the Big Bang in the City of London, where at a stroke, loads of bank regulations were scrapped. Building societies could become banks, and there was virtually no restraint on bank creation of money. She believed, as a libertarian, this demolition of the civic society that had been built up around banking was all that was necessary to ensure success. Just get rid of government interference and all will be well. There are still today many people who are in denial about the catastrophic consequence of Thatcher's libertarianism being applied to banking. Others know we are now living through the greatest crisis of modern times, and it has its roots in the Big Bang. Britain was not the only one to go for this free-for-all for banks. The USA, led by fellow Hayeken President Ronald Reagan, did the same thing. But New York and London were the biggest banking centres, and so the effect was greatest there. Other countries in the West did not adopt Austrian libertarianism to the same extent, if at all, and in the up-and-coming countries of Asia, it was not taken up at all. But the problems of liberalisation did not have to wait long to appear. On Thatcher's own watch, towards the end of the 80s, Britain was forced into crisis, and this was due to bank liberalisation, as well as other Thatcher policies. Credit flooded into people's pockets, driving a massive boom in house prices for 3 or more years, and then this was brought to a grinding halt as consumer price inflation spiked up dramatically. To stifle inflation, Chancellor Nigel Lawson drove up interest rates into double figures, throwing the economy into turmoil, with consumer spending shuddering to a halt. The interest rates meant a lot of people could no longer afford to pay the mortgage, and hundreds of thousands returned their house keys to the lenders. House prices collapsed. Businesses went into the wall, and this included many established firms of very long standing. The loss of the productive capacity of the country was catastrophic, and we have never recovered from this. True libertarians say that Thatcher's policy led quickly to disaster because she was not full-bloodedly libertarian enough, and that the state was too big. It remained at about the same size as Thatcher had inherited it throughout its reign, by the way. Well, there is little doubt that greater doses of the same medicine would not have worked any better. Thatcher-style half-baked libertarianism by that time had acquired the name of neoliberalism, which is really just libertarianism, but leaving in place a lot of the state, such as state education and welfare. Arguably, the libertarians have a point, saying neoliberalism gives you the worst of all worlds, but nevertheless, this compromised version of libertarianism became the ideological basis of all so-called new right thinking. Part 2. Thatcher's economic turnaround. It is a curious fact that in spite of being so heavily influenced by Austrian-style libertarianism, Thatcher in 1980 also signed up fully to one of its foremost rivals, the Chicago School of Monetarism led by Milton Friedman. Although Thatcher is portrayed by her supporters as a clear-eyed, single-minded visionary, the reality is that she was easily influenced by fads. There is no better illustration of this than her embracing of two opposing economic ideas at that same time. Monetarism was all about state intervention of the type the Austrians shunned. It was predicated on the simple idea that the way to control inflation was to control the money supply. This, in turn, was based on a very old economic theory, the quantity theory of money, and this tells us that prices in the shops will increase if there is more money in the economy, too much money chasing too few goods. I will not go into the detailed arguments about monetarism here, but suffice it to note that there have been many occasions, for example Britain in the noughties, where the money supply boomed and consumer inflation did not. The empirical evidence for monetarism does not exist, and in addition the theory is flawed, for if there is more money in the economy, it can just circulate more slowly and prices will stay the same. Thatcher did not see these failings, and in the early years of her reign adopted monetarism with gusto. Friedman was overjoyed, for this was the first time that his academic theories had been fully tested in a real live laboratory. Here, the laboratory was the British economy. There was an enormous squeeze put on the amount of money in circulation, in an effort to keep inflation down, which at that time had overtaken the high rate she had inherited. Three things resulted. The pound took off on the exchange markets, although this was partly due to the knowledge that the pound was about to become a petrocurrency. Secondly, as a result, exporters could not compete as imports flooded in. Thirdly, the squeeze on money and government expenditure cut off markets that businesses had formerly depended on. Unemployment took off and the economy tanked. At this point, this conviction politician, who was not for turning, dropped militarism like a hot brick and continued with the uncontaminated neoliberalism. This left Freeman in the same position as the Libertarians, complaining that militarism had not been applied long enough and fully enough. British industry has never recovered from Thatcher's militarist experiment. Part 3. Exploitation of the Prime Ministerial Power. Lord Hailsham famously said in 1978 that the office of British Prime Minister was an elective dictatorship. He was speaking as a constitutionalist, not as an historian, saying what could happen, not what actually happened. He was pointing out that if someone once elected as Prime Minister wanted to fully exploit the powers of the office, there was virtually nothing in the Constitution to constrain them. This weakness had not mattered so much until then, for Prime Ministers generally saw their role as obeying some kind of recognised consensus. They certainly expected to take their cabinet with them, and they had a regard for British traditions and ways of doing things. Obviously changes happened all the time, but the British way was to evolution more than revolution, taking as many people as possible with you. In this world, ideologies were not welcome. Whatever you may think of Keynes, the predominant economic influence before Thatcher, he was no ideologist. He was interested in making the present system work largely by pragmatic measures, and he had a proven track record in predicting problems ahead. Prime Minister Jim Callaghan had in 1978 announced that we would have to move away from Keynes, but he did not see the answer lying in the ideologies of the Austrian or Chicago varieties. He had a very strong and experienced team around him who were confronting the country's undoubted problems, and they were working through them and would have continued to do so if they had stayed in power. They were still living in the pragmatic, consensus-driven political world, which meant that Hailsham's astute observation remained largely academic. We will never know whether Margaret Thatcher had heard Hailsham's verdict on the prime ministerial power, but she certainly understood the truth of exactly what he said, however she came by it. For directly on her arrival at number 10, she began to exploit the office as an elected dictator. Dictator is a strong word, and we can argue about whether Hailsham chose well, but whatever word you use, the fact is that Thatcher as Prime Minister dictated to others more powerfully than any before her. In this lies her reputation as a conviction politician. She did not need to listen to those around her. She could ignore the advice of long-standing civil servants, jettison colleagues who were off-message, and rely on unproven doctrines by academic theoreticians for wholesale policy initiatives. Following on from Thatcher, once the cat was out of the bag on the constitutional power of the prime ministerial office, there was no going back. All the prime ministers that followed her have treated the office as she did. In this way, Thatcher completely changed the political culture of Britain. Following her style, Prime Minister Major forced through an unpopular rail privatisation a disastrous decision to join the European Monetary Union, and a squandering of taxpayers' money in the attempt to defend that decision, while George Soros notoriously was handed billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Major never apologised to the British people for this. It is hardly necessary to remind anyone of the dictatorial, arrogant styles adopted by subsequent prime ministers: Blair, Brown, Cameron, May and Johnson. Thatcher was the prime minister who found out the Constitution and exploited it to impose her extreme policies on us. This constitutional weakness can only be corrected with a new radical Republican Constitution. Part 4. Privatisation. Thatcher did not start off as a privatiser. The idea seemed to creep up on her. After all, the idea of selling off the family silver, the long-term assets the country held that contributed to the Exchequer's coffers in exchange for the short-term gain of the income from the sale, was not obviously a good idea. Thatcher, as a populist, would not at first go near it. Surely the people would rumble what was happening and how future Britons would be fleeced. Once she had concluded that she could get away with privatisation, there was no stopping her. It was sold to the public on the basis of two ideas. One, it would lead to popular share ownership. Two, private companies are automatically more efficient than state-run companies. As I have said, Thatcher was a populist and an ideologue. The first idea was populist, the second was ideological. Let's look at each in turn. What happened in reality to the idea of wider popular share ownership? Who now owns the shares? In fact, very little of the original float has remained in the hands of private individuals. The shares were all sold too cheap, and so people found themselves sitting on a potential profit, and the temptation to sell off was too strong for most. Where institutional investors, such as pension funds, have bought into ex-state industries, you might argue that they have ended up being owned by the public. But this is far from being so in many cases. In the worst cases, such as some of the water companies, the companies have ended up being almost 100% held by private equity concerns, and so the shares are no longer floated. Private equity companies exist because of the huge amount of wealth that has accumulated in recent years to the global state-free super-rich, the globalist parasites. The wealth of these individuals is so colossal that buying properties and shares is too small beer for them. They want and can afford whole companies. They particularly like cash cows, such as monopoly water companies. So ownership passes to private equity, a long way from popular share ownership. These companies do not register in Britain, but exploit tax havens to reduce their taxes to minimal amounts. Often the services they give to their customers is poor, and they use customer receipts to finance capital. They have a stranglehold over their customers in spite of the watchdogs, and so there is little need to plough back profits into investment. Turning to the second argument for privatisation, that the state cannot run companies, is pure ideology. The French electricity company, EDF for instance, is mostly state-owned, and it is as efficient as any private company. It is also predatory, as where other countries have foolishly privatised electricity, it can buy up privatised companies. So we have the irony whereby the privatised companies have been returned to state ownership, but the state in question is now foreign. Thatcherites would never accept the simple truth that an important reason why the state-owned companies in Britain functioned poorly is because the state starved them of investment. By not maintaining them properly, a self-fulfilling policy was constructed. Private entrepreneurship is the essential motor that drives an economy, and so companies should be private unless there is a compelling reason why they should not be. There are two such compelling reasons. 1. If the industry is a service industry and can never be run at a profit, This is the case with railways, for instance. This did not prevent the ideological conservatives from privatising rail. Privatisation did not alter the fact that rail companies on their own are unviable. It just meant that the subsidies go to private companies, not public companies, with all the inefficiency and unaccountability that involves. 2. If the industry is a natural monopoly. If one private company owns an entire industry and there is no competition, the consumer will be poorly served and probably exploited. This is the case with the essential public services, water, gas, electricity. If these industries are in private hands, the public will be the loser. We can all too easily end up with foreign-owned companies over which we have only limited control and that have no regard for British national interest. There may appear to be competition as you can buy, say, gas from a range of companies, but this is a farce. The supply of gas has to be along the same pipelines, whichever company nominally supplies the gas. The supposed competition just leads to inefficiency as tasks are duplicated between the different companies. The consumer will ultimately pay for these inefficiencies. And what we tend to forget is that some state industries did make profits, and these went to the exchequer and reduced taxes and state debt. Listen to anyone who was Chancellor before privatisation, and they will talk fondly of how they could see each year state industry receipts dropping into their lap. The fact that the country is broke now is partly because these revenues exist no more. But did we not benefit from the sales? Any capital the country received was squandered by Thatcher in propping up her ideologically driven policies. There was certainly a case for making parts of the industries concerned private and subject to competitive tender, but placing natural monopolies wholesale in the private hands simply makes no sense. In the latest twist, Britain is now in a position where it's seeking contractors to build new nuclear power stations. But the trouble is, there is only one tenderer, our old friend Électricité de France, EDF. One of those reviled state industry is now the only one left standing that can do the job. How many Thatcher supporters will stand up and admit that we're in this sorry position because of her privatisation policy? None. They ignore the facts and just keep spouting myths about conviction and political greatness. Part 5. The Falklands War. It is often said that Thatcher got re-elected in 1984 because of the Falklands War. But she would have been re-elected anyway, and this for one reason. The Labour Party had chosen Michael Foot as leader. Already clearly past his sell-by date, he was a creature of the Labour Party left who had been put in as leader because it was judged that he could play a role in healing the party. The Labour Party had lost interest in the bigger picture of winning the election and handed it to Thatcher on a plate. In all the myth-making surrounding Thatcher, most of it originally manufactured by her, a crucial element in the Falklands crisis gets overlooked. It should never have happened. Argentine's President Galtieri would never have been able to take the Falklands Islands if the Defence Forces and our well-funded security services at MI6 had remotely been doing their job. And there is evidence that Thatcher ignored intelligence about Argentinian preparations for the invasion of the Falklands and scrapped the only Royal Navy presence on the islands. This was still the era of the Cold War, and all eyes were on Russia, on how we could nuke Moscow in a couple of minutes' notice. The defence of British territories, you would think, was a prime function of the security services. But that was not how they saw it. They had their backs turned, and the Argentinians just walked in. Whilst it was not in Thatcher's nature to admit culpability for anything, her Defence Secretary, Lord Carrington, was of the old school and saw clearly that the government had to take responsibility for its massive oversight. He resigned his post. This grave error on the part of the British government should have shaped its response to the Argentinian invasion, for it made a pressing case for not declaring war and seeking a negotiated solution. But this was not Thatcher's way. Against all expert advice to the contrary, she ordered a foolhardy mission to send a task force to the South Atlantic and beat the Argentinians out of the islands. This military action was sheer madness. Of course, it had a chance of coming off, but the casualties on both sides would certainly be significant, and the strong likelihood was of British failure. No one had made a detailed tactical and strategic assessment of the action, and in particular, the adversary's military capabilities were not evaluated. Typical of the cavalier political attitude, our fighting forces were lumbered with the now disgraced Prince Andrew to give him a good image, which even then he was in need of. Later, high-ranking officers complained that it was made clear that not a hair on his head should be injured, as if they did not have enough to worry about. Once in place, the British fleet engaged in what many see as a criminal act by sinking the Argentine Navy light cruiser ARA General Belgrano, with a loss of over 300 Argentinian sailors' lives. At the time, she was outside the exclusion zone that the British had put in place and was sailing away from the zone. What followed this tragedy included an element of farce. The Argentinians responded to the loss of the Belgrano by sinking the cruiser HMS Sheffield with the loss of 17 lives. This took the British completely by surprise, for they had thought that Sheffield was completely out of range of any Argentinian firepower. Incredibly, what the British did not take into account is that our allies, the French, had been supplying Argentine with Exocet missiles, up-to-the-minute deadly assault weapons against which the British Navy had no real defence. This was a completely open trade, but the Royal Navy had failed to register the fact and so miscalculated completely their tactics. The nation was in a state of shock. This was a real war where people got killed, and we looked hopelessly vulnerable. Relief then followed, for it turned out that the French had only so far supplied 13 Exocets, and so a counting down of how many the Argentinians fired off started. If they'd had a good stockpile, the Royal Navy would have been blasted out of the water. France obligingly said it would suspend future deliveries. It beggars belief that the task force could have set off without intelligence that was fully available in Jane's, the popular publication on military matters, on the presence of Exocet missiles. As we know, the mission to recapture the Falkland Islands against all the odds worked. This was due to the amazing courage and professionalism of the British military and astonishing luck. But the loss of British lives and the horrendous injuries and disfigurement our soldiers suffered must be laid at the door of Thatcher. Like most wars, this was unnecessary and could have been avoided. The comprehensive peace plan proposed by President of Peru, Fernando Belaunde, was dismissed by Thatcher and her war cabinet. It is to Britain's shame that the Falklands tragedy is partly the reason for Thatcher's quasi-state funeral. It was not a victory of which Britain could be proud, but a sorry episode of incompetence, lack of foresight and foolhardiness, which was redeemed by the only people to come out of it at all honourably, our fighting men and women. To follow in Part 2. Part 6, the Channel Tunnel. Part 7, Industrial Relations. Part 8, Attack on the Civil Society. A, Attack on the Civil Service. B, Attack on the Professions. C, Attack on the Universities. Part 9, Centralisation of the State. Part 10, the Union of Britain.